but anybody
Yeah.
else?
Sounds good to me also.
Okay, sounds fine.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like it's 1 after the hour, so we'll kick this off. My name is Tim. Benno, you can kick off the next slide. Benno's running the slides. Suzanne's going to keep us all on track time-wise, I hope. She does a great job on that. So we're the chairs. Warren is our overlord. So now that he's here, we can start. And Paul Hoffman's taking minutes. I did put the agenda in the Etherpad, even though he doesn't use it. But if folks want to actually drop comments in there about things they said to make sure it's captured correctly, please, you're free to do so, and we can integrate all that. That's the fancy stuff we do. So next slide, sir. This is the note well about paying attention to IETF policies, et cetera, et cetera. By this point in the week, most people are pretty familiar with it. So please, but if you're not, please take a read on it. And next slide. We also have a new slide, this thanks to Wes, on the Code of Conduct Guidelines, 7154. We feel these are pretty straightforward. And please reach out to the chairs if you feel things aren't being addressed in the way you feel it's should be, or Warren, right? We're here for you. So don't feel afraid to reach out and sort of express opinions about this. Thanks. We can go to the next slide now. So some notes from the chairs. Just a quick heads up that the NomCon feedback is still open. So please go in there and make your opinions known. They will welcome it. We will welcome it. It's a good thing. There's some folks in DNSOP pretty regularly that are running for a few positions. So, we always like that. On another note, Kim Davies has a document about moving some stuff in int.int to historic. And I think this has been socialized in DNSOP, but also through the OARC lists. And Warren's offered to AD sponsor it. If you all want to take a read at it, and it's pretty straightforward, it's simple, clean, straightforward, we should be in good shape. But thanks, Kim, for working on that. He also promised to publish the zone after he's got all this cleaned up. So I like that. I don't know what, but I like that. That we haven't actually adopted work in a while. And we've talked about this, and Warren's talked about this with us, and we had some ideas, but then it was like, maybe we should just have a poll and have the working group sort of chime in on this, because everybody loves a good poll, right? So we're putting something together probably in the next week or so. And we've had good success with our focus interims, feedback from the authors as well as other folks. And so we're going to continue doing that on, just 1 or 2 documents, and do an hour, 1 or 2 documents to really get people sort of thinking about that. So if you've got a document that's adopted and you'd like to sort of sign up for one, just drop us a note. We will reach out to folks, but if you want to sort of push yourself to the head of the list, a good email to us kind of move us along, I think. So thanks. Next slide. And this is just some, Warren's like, let's put the pretty picture back in there. So we put the pretty picture from last time about the active working group documents and what people feel is important or not important. So there you go. We've got you a pretty picture and we think it's pretty good. So next slide. And also as a follow-up from some of the working group poll from July, 2 of the documents that were really suggested by the folks were the DNSSEC bootstrapping and the DNSSEC automation, which are both going to be discussed, and we both think are very, we would love to see the working group sort of coalesce around some of that. And also on some of the new work being suggested is the 8109 biz, which I believe we felt like we wanted to adopt at one point, and we sort of lost it in the shuffle. So we're guilty. The chairs are guilty of that, or I'm guilty of that. And I think what will happen is, once we start adopting work, the biz documents will filter up to the top first. Is probably the correct way to say that. And Warren can sort of speak on that if he wants to, any way, shape, or form. So next slide. What else are we talking about here? So some document updates. We've got 2 documents in the RFC status. 7816 biz it's in the editor thing, but they've assigned a number. I consider it done. So that's really great. And thanks to the authors for sort of getting all the work involved on that. Thanks. And on the next slide, we've got 3 other documents that, one in the editor queue, I had consideration, and then 2 that are going through the IHG evaluation, and they both are getting lots of good comments and feedback, and those are being moved along as well in a very, process sort of way. So those things are happening, and that's great. Thanks to the authors on sort of following up on a lot of those. And also almost done, we feel, when we were sort of discussing this week, glue is not optional. I think there's 1 or 2 outstanding, there's like 1 outstanding item, and once we sort of clear some of that up, I think we're ready for that one, as well as avoid fragmentation. Some of that, I think there's some editorial work we want to help on sort of clearing some of the fragmentation bits up, and also catalog zones, which Willem will talk about tomorrow due to his timing. Fields is basically done as well. They've had some good hackathon results as well. Also, the feedback from the interim on DNS error reporting, Roy's got some great feedback, and he's working to integrate all that. And our view of it is it's in really good shape and ready to go. So that was really great. So I know people thought that was kind of a strange interim item, but we got a lot of operational stuff right in there, and that was pretty great. The RR serial document, I know Hugo is working on some implementation stuff, and I see him in the audience. Maybe we should do that as an interim topic. That's been one that's sort of been, sitting on my, like, we owe the draft some work, some effort, sort of thing. So, and then because IANA consideration is basically in the editor queue and considered done, 5933 biz was on hold. We chatted it out, and what we came up with, and we'll see what happens during the working group, is changing it to informational, and then we'll proceed with a working group last call, probably starting this weekend. And we expect also, we expect everything from that. So, but thanks to the authors for being patient, and I do think, Paul's work on sort of cleaning up some of the IANA stuff actually is really super helpful in this case. So thank you, Paul. Next slide. And of course, our stuff is in the data tracker. We're shortening our list. And we feel that as we sort of get the list down a little bit more, that we'll start adopting stuff. And we're we've been discussing numbers, like how many exact drafts can we do, but I think we're taking it on a, we'll take guidance from the working group and from Warren on the best way to do that. So, so thanks, and we keep it all on GitHub as well. And I think, okay, so let's cruise over to the agenda. I think that's the next one. Yep, one more. the recurrent business is the NSEC 3 parameter setting. Wes, I think there's a great email thread about what number to use, and I love when everybody kept saying, let's just make it 0. But Wes is going to give us a great little overview on that. So next slide. And don't take this as quote unquote new business, and you can bash this as you see. It's more updates or documents that people have sort of wanted to sort of talk about. Whether or not we adopt it is sort of, that's always a bigger discussion, right? But we call it new business because it's not sort of adopted work. So I apologize. I think the wording is probably bad there. We've got DNSSEC automation, Siobhan and Schumann's document on domain verification techniques, the structured error page bit, and Brian Dixon, who did the talk in Deprive, we've chatted with him. He's revised his slides, so he's got a different slide deck. And we believe, and he's going to provide better motivation up front about what he's trying to solve here. And I think, hopefully a sort of streamlined discussion so there can be comments, because we know we were, even with 20 minutes or so, we kind of ran out of time in Deprive. So we're hoping to sort of help Brian along by, shortening that up. Thanks. And I think, what else is going on? I think that's it. So that's tomorrow's business. So that's kind of ours. If anybody has sort of agenda bashing, they like or don't like what we're doing, please speak up, or adopting new work, not adopting new work, what we're not focusing on. We really would like to hear that. I know, when we talked yesterday, the 4 of us, we were all in agreement that we'd like to hear from the working group, what can be more efficient. It's a good way to put it.
Okay. Tim,
Yep.
I'm monitoring the chat room.
Okay.
And Hugo just sent a message that about RR serial. I plan some minor updates before expiration. Hope to have implementations running too. So that's
Oh, cool.
RR
Thank
serial.
you, Hugo. Yep. So that's a great. We appreciate that, and we can chat about the, internal ideas or things of that nature. So we just didn't want to feel that you were being ignored, Hugo. So yeah. Okay. Then I think I'm done, unless people want to raise their voice, which I welcome them to do. Otherwise, we can move along to Mr. Hardiger.
Yes. I will stop sharing.
Yes. Thank you, Wes.
Wes, do you want to run your slides yourself, or shall I run them for you?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I can do them.
Yeah.
I mean, either way, but just make sure it's the most recent set.
Yep.
I did send a sharing request.
Yeah. Grant screen. So there you go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I hope everybody else doesn't have a headache like I do. So if I feel if I sound weird, that's probably why. This is the DNSSEC IETF DNSOP NSEC 3 iterations draft by myself and Victor Duchovny. I pulled it out of the oven. I poked a toothpick in it. It is so close to being ready to serve. So really, we're down to like one point, which is what we'll discuss today. But just as a reminder, the sort of the current, the point of the draft is to say things like use NSEC if you can. You should, ideally use 0 as a iterations count, and use assault only if you're going to change it. And this is the current draft table of what validators and stuff should do. I'm not going to go over it because we're going to change it today. Victor, in his massive scanning of over 12 million domains that have NSEC deployed, NSEC 3 deployed, actually that's an increase from the last time he measured, which was the last time I reported in July. So now there's 12,000, and you can see the fractions of the number of zones that are at various different values of iteration counts on the left-hand side. I did put, the 5 nines in bold. So I mean, the good news is for 500, we're at 5 nines under that. But even then, you can see that there is a decent fall off, and even 99% of NSEC 3 zones in the world today are under 20 or equal to 20. There is a break at 0 and 1, and I think 0 and 1 is one of the most confusion points. I didn't put 1 on the slide, but there's a decent jump from 0 to 1. Like most people think, oh, well, I want one iteration. Well, no, for one iteration, you actually have to set a value of 0, and I think that's confused people. So the remaining outstanding question is, what should we set as the lower limit for validators and zone owners to actually use? The previous draft had 150. The current draft has 100. And then, as a mail message I put on the Nsop list the other day, was trying to see discussion around, okay, well, what could we do? Recently, 4 implementations, have said they've, in their announcement text, have said that, they're capping it at 150. Since the discussion the other day, 2 more have promised to go down to 100. And Benno, you might want to mute your mic. You have a little bit of background feeding.
Excuse me.
Yep, no problem. So this is the final slide. And so this is what I think, if I summarize the conversation in the past week for DNSOP on the mailing list, where we ended up. So the important thing to note is, 1, most DNSOP participants really want 0. It's just a question of whether we can state that or not. So I think, I was out walking around the other day and I said, the right way to handle this was with should, mays, musts, and that type of stuff. And then multiple people actually started saying the same thing on the mailing list, so that actually works well. So I think this is what we might want to say. And so what I really want to hear from today is people that disagree with anything on this slide. So to read it out, you should use, validators should treat iterations greater than 0 as insecure. And that is a bold change from where we are, right? You may treat, iterations of 1 as, you actually may, that second line is wrong. It should be, you may treat iterations of 1 and you may want to validate it. And don't treat it as insecure, because of that one number that is out and so prevalent, that only 7% of the existing zones out there are using 0. You must treat iterations greater than 100 as insecure, and you may treat iterations greater than 500 as serve fail. And remember, that was something that we decided as an optional thing. People don't have to do it. They can just continue treating things as insecure, and some implementations, may want to return serve fail if they want to be a little more aggressive and really yelling at people that don't do that. And then, for the zone owner side of things, whether you're an operator that's managing a zone on behalf of somebody else, or whether you're actually controlling the iterations yourself, you should use an iterations count of 0, and you must use an iterations count of less than or equal to 100, which again matches the must up here. So these 2 values should always stay in lockstep. So what I am done talking, and we may get 15 minutes back if nobody has issues with this particular proposal. But of course we have people with issues with this particular proposal, so we'll start with Victor. Victor, you can unmute and go. While we're waiting for Victor, Ted, do you want to try? Ted Lemon, Ted?
Thanks for doing this. It's really great work, and I totally support it. I do have one question, which is the choice of insecure versus, so the text actually says insecure, but I'm wondering if there's a difference in behavior that might be appropriate for a validating stub resolver as opposed to a validating caching resolver. And I don't actually know the answer to this, but like my instinct is that the stub resolver should treat an iteration of greater than 100 essentially as an attack and punish it by failing to resolve the result. In other words, it should treat it as bogus rather than as insecure, because insecure isn't really accurate. But that's just my my instinctual reaction. I don't know that that's the correct reaction. I'm just curious what you think of that.
Well, that's a good question. So we should hear from other people. My gut reaction on splitting what type of resolver it is, leads to problems and camels and things like that. We should just have everything do the same. The reason for doing insecure versus serve fail essentially, or failing to resolve at all, is it actually matches what NSEC 3 does today. So the NSEC 3 draft says if you're using something greater than 4096, I mean the values are just huge. Just treat it as insecure. So there's precedence for that is really what it came down to. And you're still trying to do the end goal of helping actually do a resolution, even if you can't prove that. And remember, this is for proof of non-existence, right? So you'd still return an NX domain. You just wouldn't, be able to verify it.
Right. Thanks.
Victor, do you want to try again?
Figured out where the unmute is.
There we go.
All right. So a couple of things. One, I don't know if everybody realizes, but when we treat high iteration counts as insecure, the entire zone essentially becomes insecure. It's not just the negative answers. It's that because one can then forge delegations. Every answer in the zone is then subject to man-in-the-middle attack. If you get an answer with a valid signature, sure, you can trust it, but you might have gotten an unsigned answer and trusted that instead. So it's a very marginally secure zone at that point. Essentially, no answer is secure. If a TLD were to go, above the iteration limit, then all of its child zones become completely insecure. So this is pretty drastic. The other comment is, in terms of the gap between insecure and serve fail does have the advantage that it preserves the security of the zone, right? They don't ever go insecure, all right? If they screw up, they get to find out about it and then ideally fix it. So it would be ideally nice to keep that range small, maybe even not have insecure fallback. But of course, in practice, if on the ground, not enough domains get the message, and some people, are happy enough to operate in this gray zone where they think they're secure, but they're not. Rather than serve fail, we can, let them be that way. So I don't know what the answer is, but just for clarity, insecure is very insecure. You have no security once you're over the limits.
Thanks for the clarifications, Victor. Jim? Chairs, you might want to cut the queue or decide when you want to do that based on time. I'm not watching time. Jim?
Thanks, Wes. I hope you can hear me now. I was having problems earlier today.
Yep. You're good.
Great stuff. I pretty much agree with what Ted was saying before. I think we probably need to look at the validation side as not having this flag as insecure middle ground. In my view, either a zone is secure or it's not secure. And I think it's better to return serve fail if the number of iterations is too high. And also the point that Victor was just making about the potential for denial of service attacks or spoofing attacks if a zone is accidentally marked as insecure and it's not quite there. So I would prefer not to do this insecure middle ground and just take a very binary view of it. Either the zone is secure or it's not. There's nothing in between.
Okay, so you essentially want serve fail for greater than 0 or 1, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. We'll go on, Ralph.
Having a kind of middle ground can cause problems, so I would also prefer one signal. And I think in early discussions we thought about doing the serve at 150. So that as a starting point, because the problem now, if you have a resolver that wants to do the kind of hard cut, it cannot comply to this graph because in the current graph, the must is at 100. So between 100 and 150, or 500 in that case, there is a behavior that is currently not possible if you want to just have really hard cut.
Thanks. You actually bring up another point that I meant to mention, which I haven't, which is that there was discussion on the list that we should produce this RFC with the goal being 0. I think there's general consensus around that. And allow validators to slowly achieve that based on measurements by Victor or others in terms of what actually happens in the world. So you know, functionally be non-compliant to the RFC when it comes out, you know, and wait for a fall off time, and then get to a serve fail or something like that. Okay, thanks, Petra.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was the one who was proposing to specify the goal and, you know, let people slowly approach that goal. And I think that for the zone owners, the RFC should be just must less than 1 or 0 or 1 or something like that, because that's the only interoperable value in the long term. And I don't think it's useful to update the RFC in, you know, in a year or two. So I think that we should be very strict for zone owners, and we can be much more relaxed in the specification for the validators, because we don't even need to specify the value for validators. It can be just, you know, think about the value before you release your software and do your measurements. Because for validators, it's basically impossible to prescribe the value because it's changing all the time. But for zone owners, we can specify what they has to do to be interoperable in the long term. In my view, we don't need to like refine the details.
Okay.
Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Do you have an opinion on the serve fail aspect of whether it should be a low value or something like it is now, with whether insecure or not is?
Yeah, I'm afraid it is same story, because right now we cannot do safe fail above certain point, but it will change over time. So again, I would just describe for validators what needs to be considered when the validator vendor is setting the thresholds. But I don't think we have to specify the values in the draft actually, because we can describe the logic that, well, if you know the current prevalence of iteration values, you will see distribution, and then, you know, make up your mind, and these are the consequences of your decisions. I mean, if we describe that the insecure means actually insecure for everything, not just for the NX domain, and that the safe file has better security properties, then I think it's enough in the draft for the validator vendors to decide.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, chairs. I will take all that input and do something with it. I think there will certainly be more comments on the list. So.
Okay. Thank you, Wes. Yeah. So indeed, so, yeah. No. Speaking now as an implementer, I agree with Petter. Also for well, and also I want to know that in the serve fail behavior is new. The other are caps on iterations. The serve fail is new, and I think yeah, we will follow the drafts and the RFC, and also of course thank you, Victor, for measuring the current state of the number of NSEC iterations being used by operators. Okay. I want to go to the next presentation. Let's see, where are we here? That's Ulrich or Schumann? Ulrich, there you are. What do you want? You want to run the slides? You can ask to run the slides. There's a new option here. There we are. Yeah. Granted.
Can you hear me actually?
Yes.
Good. I have intermittent failures, so I have actually okay. This seems to work. Good. Hello, I'm Ulrich from the Swedish Internet Foundation, and this is work that we actually a whole group of doing, but Schumann started this with his multi-signer document a few years back, and so we have presenting this work at IETFs before, and we have been continuing working on it, and so I was going to do a status update where we are in the work. And so we have the algorithms are for joining and leaving a multi-signer group is defined. We have algorithms defined for key rollovers of a whole group of signers. We are working on a controller software that can orchestrate the whole multi-signer setup, joining, leaving, algorithm or key rollovers. And one of the missing pieces for this to be really automated is that the parent zone would have to support CSync. And this is actually what we have been doing at the Swedish Internet Foundation. We are implementing CSync scanning. We started with CDS, CDNS key scanning last month, and we will start with CSync scanning hopefully next month before Christmas. Let's see. Okay, with this, yes. Okay, so what do we have left to do? Obviously, we have written up all the algorithms, but we have not made real-world verification, and we'll do this with our software implementation, and we hope to do this between this IETF and the next one. And then we will have to make more stringent timing definitions. There's a lot of dependencies on TTLs and timeouts, and I think we need to be a bit more stringent on what these timing definitions are. And I think that is my part. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Yes, and so this was added by Schumann, but I think I can speak to this too. Okay, if you're following the ICANN process, there is a DNSSEC day, basically, the ICANN meetings, and there is a small, on the DNSSEC day, there is a DNSSEC automation panel that Steve Crocker has been running together with Schumann, and there's a lot of work around DNSSEC automation. There was a workshop of the RSEC, the committee of ICANN, about DNSSEC automation. So there's a lot of movement around this. And I think, yeah, so there's this work that is really looked at in other places. And yes, before I come to this, what I too wanted to say that we have been working on a way to, so one of the special use cases of this multi-signer is to take a domain and move it from one signing DNS provider to another signing DNS provider. And one of the requirements is that both have the same algorithm. And this is of course doable for large organizations, because then you can pay for it and you can make requirements to your service providers. But if it's your personal domain, you probably can't do that. And registrars or other hosting providers are not very open to making changes to their environment for just your domain. So what we in practice would like to do is to be able to move a domain from one signer to another signer, but they have different algorithms for signing. And this will need some additional work, and we will have to go back to how DNSSEC is validated actually, and see what we can do there to make this work. And so this will be future work after we have the first one finished. And yes, so and we would like to ask the working group for adoption for this work, so that we yes, get this documented and defined how to move your domains around and how to run them in this more resilient setup of multi-signer. Thank you. And Schumann, please go ahead.
Schumann, yeah, please go ahead. You're muted, Schumann? Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, I had to click an extra button. So I just wanted to say that working on this draft has helped us to talk with implementers and managed DNS providers alike to implement the key management interfaces that allow multi-signer operation to work smoothly, and that in turn helps us solve the inter-provider handoff smoothly as well. So we think there's good benefit to the operational DNS community generally, so we would encourage the working group to consider adopting this draft.
Thank you, Shumon. Yeah, as Tim already presented at the start, you are on the shortlist for working group adoption, and we will start the process after next week. But again, we discussed this also with the Nsop chairs and the AD. But ideally we see about 4 or 5 active drafts in the working group, and active not being in the ISG queue or editor queue or on hold. We're close to that with the current state of the document. So we're open for adopting new work. And as Tim presented on his slides, your draft is also on this list.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Paul, please go ahead.
Greetings. So this follows up on Shumon's question. Does this have to be in DNSOP? And the reason I ask is this. Yes, it obviously relates to operations, but it really relates to operators and how operators hand things off and such. I could completely see this being in a different working group that is much more operator oriented than protocol oriented. From what Ulrich said, I think the issues that are open that are will be dealable with, but I think need to be discussed, are really not ones that we are necessarily experts at in DNSOP. And so I could see a purpose-specific group that is about how do operators work with each other when doing handoffs, and have this be part of that. Not saying it shouldn't be in DNSOP, but I'm not sure that it needs to be in the same queue with lots of other things that we are doing that are much more protocol focused than operator focused. Just a thought.
Thank you. Noted. So Ulrich, do you want to run the queue yourself, or shall I call for the next?
Oh, please, we continue with Peter.
Yep.
Okay. Paul just said that most of the proposal concerns DNS operators only and not the protocol. And I wanted to point out, I don't know if it's in the draft, that there may be a protocol implication in case of key rollovers or key algorithm rollovers. I don't remember exactly what the circumstance was. Maybe Shumon or Ulrich, but wasn't there some requirement that you have to have signatures? Yeah, I remember. If you have 2 providers, they have to sign the DNS key record set on each side with their respective keys. And if one provider decides to change the algorithm, then the other doesn't use the new algorithm and can't sign the DNS key record set appropriately. And I think that requirement comes from some DNSSEC RFC. I don't have the section in my head. And I remember there was some kind of complication like that. So maybe there is a protocol implication. Just putting it out there.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Ralf? Ralf Weber, would you?
Okay, so there was a time when there was DNSX that cared for protocol and DNSOP that cared for operations. And then DNSOP started to do, well, we would do it all together. But I think that this is exactly the work that belongs in DNSOP, and I very much would encourage the work to take that work up and adopt the draft.
Thank you, Ralf. And Victor?
Also think that, sorry, I also think that implementers of name servers, not necessarily operators, probably need to make software changes to support this work. And so exposure in this working group where the right people pay attention, I think is appropriate.
Thank you. Yes, to this point, I can say that yes, we are doing this. We're implementing this controller software right now, and there is actually a quite complicated state machine in it to make this work. And what I can say is that it would be much easier to implement like a peer-to-peer version of it in a name server, because the name server already had the signer already had the state of all the keys. But I mean, that is obviously a future development that we could talk after we actually have verified that this is working in the first place. Okay, I think that was the cue.
Any other questions? We still have time for one. No. Okay, thank you, Ulrich and Schumann. So, yeah, concluding, I think you're well on your way in writing the document. And for your own timeline, what do you think? So, well, they're both operational. You are implementing stuff, but also for the draft, how much work do you expect?
Well, we expect that we would have the implementation ready in the next months, and then we would run experiments before the next IETF so that we could, update the document with the remaining to-dos, and then depending on feedback from the working group, we hope that we're good to go. But I mean, there's always ifs, so there's always details.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Ulrich.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're doing well with time. Next presentation is by Shivan, Shivan is in the room. Hi, Shivan. Do you want to present your slides yourself? So I uploaded them already in Meet Echo. So if you, you ask. There you go.
Great, perfect.
Excellent.
Should I start?
Yeah, yes, please.
Sounds good. Hi all. I'll be talking about domain verification techniques using DNS, which is a draft that Schumann and I have been working on. We also presented this at the last IETF, and we've gotten some good feedback before and after that, and we wanted to ask for adoption. So just very briefly, what is domain verification? What is domain verification? So essentially, as folks probably know, many providers on the internet need users to prove that they have some kind of control over a domain, and service providers ask users to put a DNS record in their zone that proves that they're the ones who control their domain. And a good example is Let's Encrypt with the DNS01 challenge, and you put the challenge text record, and then once it's verified by Let's Encrypt, you get issued a cert. And I won't go into the whole draft because we talked about it last time, but just as a refresher, the draft is fairly simple. It gives an overview of existing techniques, talks about text records and CNAME, which are the two ways in which we saw that service providers right now are doing DNS-based domain verification, and also we give recommendations. Some of them are targeted domain verification so that there isn't bloat at the label, and also time-bound checking, because we notice that some service providers ask people to just keep the verifying records around for a very long time, which is again not great for bloat. And also we recommend the use of we suggest the use of DNSSEC to prevent spoofing. And I put in a link to the 111 presentation over here. And we've gotten a bunch of feedback. on the mailing list and at the mic, and there were some security issues that were talked about at the mic, especially last time, and we've been using GitHub to capture all of that. And I think, we know that detailed security analysis is needed, but I think that would really like benefit from the involvement of the working group. And that's basically it. So yeah, I think Shuman and I would both want to ask for adoption.
Thank you, Sivan. So first of all, let's see if there are any hands raised. No, there's no one in queue. Going once, going twice. Yeah, Paul, please go ahead. Oh, sorry, Paul. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay. I just wanted to reiterate again, as I did on the last meeting, that this is super important. This is a huge problem, and we should not stall this and really move this forward fast.
Okay, thank you. Is there more support in the room? I've just went over the mailing list, and there was There was a good discussion on the mailing list after the last presentation. Shuman, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. So Benno and chairs, the other thing I would recommend that you do is look at the minutes and the recording of the last presentation that we did. There was quite a lot of vocal support for this draft, right, being adopted, and the fact that a lot of these domain verification techniques are they've grown up organically and ad hoc, right, and no one sat down and done any like serious security analysis of these schemes, and that's kind of like a big gap that the DNS community can jump in and make sure that these things are being done in a secure and maintainable fashion.
Thank you, Shuman. Joey.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, other than working more on that security analysis, what would be the next step for this? And I see it hasn't been updated since the previous IETF, so I was just wondering, like, what are the reasons? How to phrase this? Like, what has changed in order, like, to support adoption better this time, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think we've just been gathering feedback in the GitHub issues, I guess, and that's where all of them are right now. And in terms of work to do, I think there's like a few sections to be filled out, especially like recommending like when to use text versus CNAME. But yeah, I mean, from the point of view of the authors, I think we also thought that it was ready for adoption last time. But we also figured that it would be good to give just a refresher at this IETF, and yeah, again, ask for adoption.
Should we do a count of hands then? I mean, show of hands or something?
I'll leave that up to the chairs, but
yeah. Thank you, Siva. So Joey, so indeed in Nsop we go to the mic indeed. So it's support in the working group. Then we take it the call for adoption to the mailing list. And on the mailing list there's the formal call for adoption. But again, as we are working on our backlog, and we're going a good, we did a good job in the past month. So we have to be cautious not to accept too many new drafts, because then we're in the same situation that there are too many active drafts and there's less focus. This is also a result of the previous discussions of the working group, not only the DNSOP chairs and the AD, but also the working group participants, that we need to focus our work. So it's not a qualitative how do you say that? statement, not to adopt or postpone. It's really managing workload. And we did hear you. We did hear the different participants about the importance of this work. And maybe I should give the word to Tim, maybe. And Brett, you're still in queue. So, but
I was waiting for Brett first. So, unless he's done.
Yeah. Okay. No. So definitely, the chairs will be in contact with Shivan and Shubhan. Also, making an indication how much work there's to be done on the document, but also for the working group, and plan the work. Yeah.
Okay.
Brett, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Brett.
We can't. Well, I can't hear you, Brett. No. I do. The mic's showing up, but it's so you maybe another button.
I'll speak quickly, Brett, and then if you can figure that out in the short term, how's that? So,
yeah.
Okay, cool. Speaking as an operator, I think this is like way important, and as I've sort of hammered on Shuman and Shivan, they should just keep hammering on this because this is good stuff. So, and we'll figure out the whole adoption thing, right? So don't stop, as I keep telling you two, right? Work. So I always feel like I'm just cracking the whip on Shuman, and I feel sorry about that. So I apologize, Shuman.
Yeah. No, definitely, it's good work. Yeah, but it's yeah. We have also managed the workload, but I think we're in good shape now as a working group and in adopting new work. Brett, can you try it again? No, sorry, I don't hear you. Maybe you can type your question. I will relate. Yeah, thanks. Shuman.
Yeah, so just answering Tim, I think that's fine. We can keep plugging away at the draft, Shivan and I, but we were hoping if it was adopted early, we could recruit more collaborators to help us with the security analysis and more extensive analysis of these schemes. So that was, in our opinion, one of the benefits of earlier adoption. But yeah, I mean, point taken. I realize you have to manage the queue of work, so we can plug away at it by ourselves in the meantime. And if anyone wants to collaborate with us, just ping us.
Let's speak out. Yes, let's collaborators, please step up.
Yeah, I already see Paul volunteering in the chat, and anybody else that wants to help get this draft ready for adoption.
Okay.
Go ahead and do
Thank you. Yep. Didn't know that, Shuman. So, we'll find you people. How's that?
Yep. Thanks. All right. And thanks. We've recruited Paul. That's good.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Question from Brett, and relaying from the Jabber room. I was just going to A, add my support, and B, question the title of the draft. It says survey, but you talk about recommendations. The title may confuse people into thinking it's just informational.
Yeah, from our point of view, it is informational because we're trying to capture as much, first of all, the survey of what people are doing in the field right now, and then also the different trade-offs that people might want to make. Mm-hmm. So this would not be a normative document. This would more capture the guidance and what people think that we should do. When you should use a CNAME record versus a text record for verification. So this would be more. This would be more like guidance than prescriptive.
Okay. Thanks. Peter. So I also asked my co-chair, Suzanne, how are we doing with respect to time? Okay, so Peter, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who is what kind of parties are involved in the DNS ops group. I mean, obviously, name server implementers, resolver operators, and auth operators, and all these people. Regarding this draft, I wonder who the addressee is, because, for example, in the case of certificate issuance, I guess that that would be something that CAs would have to expect from the customers. So for example, Let's Encrypt would have to say, you should put this and that record into the DNS. So CAs have to be convinced. But I don't think CAs are part of the DNS ops group. Then for GitHub verification or domain verification for Office 365 or something, then these companies have to be convinced. And I'm not sure if they consider themselves involved with DNS operations also. Well, I think these recommendations are good. I just wonder if they will get heard when you put them in DNS ops. So who's the addressee of the draft?
Yeah, I think it is definitely like service providers for sure. And I think the idea is that a lot of folks have come up with like ways of doing domain verification that they kind of just, and we talked about this in the draft a little bit, like some of them extremely well formatted and some of them are just, just here to put a string and they don't really talk about any requirements around that. So, and we think this happened because of the lack of guidance. And so yeah, so I think the hope is that given like an IETF document, that'll help, so people can like point towards that and kind of use that when designing domain verification techniques or domain verification methods for their own services. Shimon, did you want to add to that?
I had to unmute myself again. So just to follow up, Siobhan, I think, Peter, to your point, yeah. So I think our expectation is once we develop this draft a little bit more, we will have to do outreach to application service provider communities, right, to kind of clue them in to what, if any, recommendations come out of this draft to see if we can persuade them to adopt those recommendations. So I think we expected that to be part of the process.
Thank you both. Any final words? No. So thank you, Sivan and Shuman, for pushing this work. And definitely the chairs will have a follow-up with you. There are, well, Paul Wouters and also Brett Carr volunteered to help. That's good. And we will definitely make progress in the next month. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Benno. Thanks, chairs.
Yeah. Thank you. Next, we have, let's look at the agenda. Structured data for DNS error, access denied error pages. Dan, yeah, there you are. Dan, how do you want to run the slides? I can do that for you. We uploaded them already in Meet Echo. Oh, sorry, I see the request. Yeah. There you go. Can't hear you yet.
That better?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So my name is Dan Wing. I'm talking about structured DNS error page. So our purpose for this document is to provide some parsable data. We decided on JSON for the user and IT to troubleshoot why a DNS query was filtered by something upstream. And then this information can be displayed in logs and nothing done with it interactively at the time it occurs, or it can be displayed on the user interface of the operating system, the browser, or whatever. And the adjustments we made here better handle headless devices that don't have a web browser and don't need to use a web browser to go get the information. That was one of the deficiencies of the draft that we're superseding with this that's mentioned at the bottom, draft ready DNS op error page. We've received a bunch of comments. I saw a bunch came in late yesterday, my time, from Peter, which was pretty cool. And I'll talk about a couple of those things as we go through. So the design handles a commercial filter and an IT or parental operated, or whoever is operating another layer of filtering to filter whatever that they additionally want to do. So the commercial DNS filter might filter malware, might be a government mandated filter to filter child porn sites, and then the IT operated or parental operated DNS filter might do some other stuff, all eventually going to the client. So the protocol allows these filters and these blocks to be propagated down should the filter in the middle decide that it wants to propagate that down. In a lot of situations with parental filtering and with IT filtering, the intermediary needs to be involved to resolve problems with filtering done by the upstream because they own the contract, they have the phone number to call to resolve those issues. But that it turns into something the protocol handles either way, but there's operational concerns and issues there. The packet format is the usual. And then this slide I'll update for the meeting materials. I noticed this morning that there's a couple things missing in it. But the JSON that comes down is purposefully as tight as I could figure out how to make it. So the C: is intended to have anything that the filter service wants to include to help it identify this filtered event. So this could be a timestamp like shown here. It could be any unique value, a sequence number that it wants to keep track of for each time it does a filter. Could be anything that it likes. Doesn't matter. The protocol itself doesn't care. This is something that is generated and a responsibility of the DNS filter itself. The D: is the domain of the DOH/DOT server that the user is connected to. This is to detect if the DOH/DOT server is just blindly proxying and forwarding this traffic, or is actually aware of this extension. There's some stuff talked about in the draft on why that's valuable. The J: is some free-form text. We have a discussion point later to talk about what language that's in, which is a thing that causes me a little bit of grief. Only the D and the J are mandatory as specified currently in the draft. Peter had some comments on that. O is free-form organization that is doing the filtering, and R points off to a justification for why this filtering happens. So it might be an employee contract for why a job site or a guns and ammo site or whatever was being filtered, or point to a country specification, a country requirement that child porn be filtered if that was the reason that it was filtered. So then on the client, it constructs the URL by prefixing HTTPS to the D: value and appending the query parameters for C. What I missed here on this slide, and I will update in the meeting material, is it also appends the domain queried from the DNS query and the record type that was queried, like A or quad A or whatever. There's some security considerations. One is we want no clickable links in the O and the J fields because they then need to be sanitized on where they're going and what they're for. So that's something that needs to be probably cleaned up in the client. How to do that, we don't specify quite yet. We need to socialize that a little bit more, see how we want to handle that. Encrypted and authenticated DNS on that first bullet is mandatory because we don't want arbitrary justification text to be inserted into a DNS query response pair. Would be bad. And then if the URL is being visited for the C and the R pages that are formed, that URL should be in a constrained environment, similar to what captive portals are doing today. But keep in mind that processing those two things, the C and the R fields, is optional. because again, we're expecting and hoping that the J field, the justification free form, contains enough information to understand why this was filtered. That's why we're not using predefined, error code number 1, error code number 2, error code number 3, which Etsy is taking a path of defining for filtering, but rather free-form text, so that anything that the operator wants to put in here for why they filtered can actually be put in here. And this is my last slide. So a couple of discussion points that I'd like to get feedback on the list or right now are how to handle the language in the J, and perhaps also the organization field, but really the justification field is the one that is most concerning. That if it comes back in German, you don't speak German, it is not helpful. Some consideration is if that comes back, a web browser could itself, with its built-in translate capability, just translate it for the user. Not terribly appealing, but some discussion on that would be kind of nice. And then also the isolated browser environment and how folks feel about that. There is an increase in security posture for the client for that situation, but it also means the user doesn't get autofill and also doesn't get cookies to open a ticket with their service provider, or whoever is doing that filtering. Because it's in this constrained environment that's not going to autofill, and they have to type everything manually, which is a real pain. And I don't know if this is interesting enough for the working group to consider adopting it quite yet, or if we'd like to go another cycle, but most interested in those first two discussion points. So that's my presentation.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, there's a queue. Dan, you want to run the queue yourself?
No, I don't. But thanks.
Yeah, no, excellent. Ben, please go ahead.
Hi. So we've been talking about this topic for a long time, and so I've been saying my thought about this for a long time, which is I am very, very cautious about anything here that gives the DNS operator the ability to jump into a connection that wasn't for them and present the user with any information, especially information that the user can't verify, especially information that would potentially take the user to, for example, a different web property. In my view, there's no safe use case here that involves presenting this to the user, at least not in a web context. And that's okay. I think there's actually value nonetheless in this draft. But what I would really like is a shift to emphasis on technical use cases and debugging, where the risk of user harm is minimal. And I think a generalization here. In my view, access denied is not the only interesting use case here, and this exact format or technology could apply equally well to diagnosing other DNS failures. In general, I think this could be essentially a useful addendum to the extended error codes draft to provide debugging at the client with more general structured information. But I don't think there should be any expectation that this information is surfaced to an ordinary user, where it could be used as part of an attack, where it could be used to lie to the user about the reason for certain kinds of filtering, or attempt to scare the user, present the user with scary information about something to try to interfere with their perception of what they're accessing.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Next, Jonathan Reed.
I take Ben's points. Like I said, we've been talking about this for a while. I have my views on it. I think there is a real use case here for debugging. I think there's a use case here for enterprises, particularly enterprise products, malware filtering, all of this stuff. And I think in a world in which I simply get an NX domain, I don't know whose problem that is. If I get an NX domain along with some indicator that that NX domain was intentional, or that or was fabricated or whatever, I think there's something in between DNSR codes and here we're going to go automatically load this URL for you. And I think this draft can talk about what that is. And I think that's, the direction to go in. And I think it can provide guidance to IoT device creators and browsers and things like that. I take the point about attacks. I have a hard time envisioning an attack that says, I see what you are asking for, and something is telling you you're not allowed to have it. Doesn't give you a phone number, doesn't give you a URL, doesn't give anything, just it's not just you, right? That is the signal that this conveys, and there's value in that, in my opinion.
Okay. Cool.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew Kempling.
Hi. 2 points really. One, just to echo something that Petter said in the chat, which I'll read it out loud because it summed up what I was thinking, but more succinctly than I would have phrased it, which is bad sensors sort of do just fine without support for this draft already, whereas the draft supports good sensors who want to be transparent about what they block and why they block it to their users. And I think that's really the key here, to actually, for the well-behaved. I mean, sensors is a pejorative term, but whatever. And sort of notwithstanding that, there are valid reasons to block access to content. This actually gives visibility to that. And then second point, the current user experience is crap. Yeah, let's be honest. NX domain or a blank screen is pretty hopeless. I often remind people about RFC 8890. The internet is meant to be for end users. This document gives us an opportunity to actually make it a much better end user experience in enterprises with malware, etc. And I really think the problems have been exaggerated, and there's a really positive reason for going with this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. Next, Eric Orth.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think my opinion of this is as far as ever showing such information in UI, I think Ben gave a pretty good description of why it's, I think, scary for pretty much any client to be able to show such information from the UI. If user types in HTTPS example.com and we stick something in the content pane that's not from example.com or from the browser itself, which is controlled, that's just a very scary security situation. I can't do anything with anywhere touching that without talking to a huge number of security consultants on our side and figuring out if there's any safe way we can do that. And at least in the old version of this, there were pure UI. It never rose to the priority level where I could even drive that and get enough opinions to even approach it. But as far as a pure debugging scenario, yeah, sure, it sounds very similar to EDE, which is something we could just stick in our debug logs and have available there for either us to debug stuff or for users to debug stuff. And the question then is, if this is just filling a similar role to EDE of just making the information known that this is, this was blocked for this common reason, are we getting enough value out of this compared to EDE to be worth pursuing, to be worth Resolve or sending this information? If it's not, then I don't know if this is enough to do. So in the very least, I think we need more information on just how this ideally goes alongside EDE before anyone can really consider adopting and much less consider implementing anything along these lines.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Paul.
So I'm busily typing minutes, and I found myself flinching at two people who spoke before me, which is why I'm speaking. The idea that you could use this protocol or any freaking protocol just in the enterprise space, but not over the whole internet, is, I mean, it's even scarier to me than I think this is scary for folks like Ben. I fully agree with the idea that you don't want to show users information that they could mistake as coming from a website. If they ask to go to a website and they're getting information from an intermediary DNS server, you got to make it super, super clear that this did not come from them. But I am even more frightened by the idea that people think, oh, we'll just use this in enterprise. And Dan, I know you've been on both sides of it's the whole internet or it's just enterprise. And I think, you know, with stuff you're doing at Citrix now, you're more on the just enterprise side. Do you feel that this could be safely scoped to just enterprise?
No, I don't see a reason to scope it to just enterprise myself.
Okay.
Because I think it's easy to show that this text that you're seeing did not come from the site you're visiting. We're doing that today. The industry's doing that today with an X domain. It shows I couldn't get there. I couldn't find the server, and it shows a message.
And I live with a use case where that doesn't work, where the person will say the website says this when it's very clearly what you just said, which was it was in fact Safari saying this. So yeah, I have some fears as well, particularly if you're not feeling that it should be limited to the enterprise. So just wanted to throw that in there.
With bring your own device and taking my work computer to Starbucks, you know, which is an enterprise scenario and which isn't. You know, and Starbucks may want to do filtering locally themselves, you know, for their, you know, whatever their reasons are, you know, to use their network for free. You know, buy a coffee and don't view porn because it upsets everyone else in the coffee shop. Reasonable. It's their network. Don't know. But yeah, I don't see a way to restrict anything to just enterprise. I mean, you know, in theory, IMAP was that way back in the day, but it certainly isn't now.
Yeah. Right. Okay, very good. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, finally, Brian, please go ahead.
Been following it too closely, but I'm thinking from the perspective of having looked at and even done stuff with RPZ in the past. One of the things about RPZ changing response codes is that it's incompatible with DNSSEC, for example. But if you, for example, had an RPZ response that is signed by the RPZ operator or whatever the source is, that creates a kind of a provenance on the response. That's something that might be a way of proving who actually did that, and you can then, as either the enterprise or the end user, decide whether you want to trust that or not, and it can be a comparison against do I treat this as a serve fail because I don't trust that source, or do I do trust that source and I'm just going to happily acknowledge the blockage? Anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah. Yeah, we had the authors, we had a discussion on that for probably 45 minutes and decided to not go down that path. Partially because, you know, if the requirement to start to block, it starts off with you have to do DNSSEC, it gets scary fast. But yes, that would be a much more authoritative way of identifying who modified that record, and you know, or who created that record. Very much like how TLS fake certificates are done for TLS proxying.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I think you got enough feedback from the room.
Yeah, that was great feedback. I appreciate it. Thanks for everyone's time and reading the draft and all that. That was great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then the final presentation is by Brian Dixon. We reserved about 30 minutes for the presentation. They're both it's a presentation of 4 documents, and the same, well, not the same presentation, but a similar presentation has been given by Brian at Deprive earlier today. And we decided to also allocate 30 minutes for Brian in Nsop, because it both discusses Nsop drafts and Deprive drafts. And to give context, Brian asked to present all the documents at once for the different venues, both Deprive and Nsop. Good. Brian, are you ready? How do you want to run? Do you want to run the slides yourself from me,
no,
or I can do that?
That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. And I know it's probably a little bit unusual, but could I invite Paul Hoffman to the mic first to give me some immediate feedback on the clarity of what the goals are, or what the use cases are? I'm not sure that I've done a good job of that, and if he can give a little bit of feedback as I go through this, that'd be great. Thanks. So what this is talking about is mostly a derivative from an initial draft on authenticated DNS over TLS to authoritative that I put together. And there are pieces of it that I pulled out that belonged maybe more appropriately in Nsop or as little standalone elements in Deprive. The goal is to provide a complete package of implementation guidance or specifications to allow a resolver to talk to an authoritative, have the ability to establish an authenticated connection to the authoritative server with respect to a specific domain name that it wants to send queries about. And all of the stuff is about how to do the discovery and signaling, do it securely, do it in a way that's downgrade resistant. So next slide. So it's privacy protection is the main thing, but that's pretty common across all of a lot of competing suggestions or drafts or proposals in Deprive. I was taking this as a complete set of things, and some of these are involving different solutions to some of the same underlying problems. One common thing for any of these is the authoritative server's identity must be authenticated if you want to do authenticated ADOT. For that to be viable, I've come to the conclusion you need to have a secure delegation to the name server's name, the zone containing that. It has to be deployable in a reasonably short time, so I'm assuming the use of stuff that's only in DNS with as few new protocol elements as possible, and without requiring any major changes or even anything above the most minor on the registrar mechanisms for transmitting stuff upstream within the DNS system. Explicit signaling of support and being downgrade resistant. Next slide. So the main ADOT ends up calling out a couple of new small drafts. One is a thing I'm calling NSV. That was the DNS or DS hacks draft. This is a new DNS key algorithm that is used to protect delegation NS records via a DNSSEC signature over a DS record, which contains a hash of the name server name. It's the only, you need to have some way of validating the target of an NS record in the parent, the delegation, in order to be able to trust the name that's being used in that. Since all of the rest of it, including the actual name used in the certificate for TLS, as well as any signaling, those are all dependent on that name. So that's one of the drafts, is just about how to accomplish that using a DNS key algorithm. The second draft is a thing called the DNST. It's a new RR type, and it's simply explicit support for transport, tied to the domain name of the name server. And the name server domain has to be DNSX signed, so this becomes a protected signaling thing, so it's downgrade resistant. And glue guidance is kind of optional, but it's useful potentially to compare the glueless guidance against what DS glue has in it. But I don't think it's necessary to discuss in this forum right now. Next slide. And I'm using TLS for ADOT, sorry, TLSA for ADOT. I should have said TLSA, not TLS. And I've started with the assumption that I'm going to need a new RR type, which is an alias for TLSA. That might not be the case. The validation of the TLS certificate that eventually gets presented to the resolver is an important part of this. And I can see there's only really two good ways of doing that validation on a certificate, WebPKI or TLSA. And since TLSA is part of the DNS standard, and I've already said for the transport flag validation, that zone has to be signed anyway. So there's not a lot of additional incremental overhead in saying, let's use a TLSA record. If you can validate the TLSA record, you're good to go. You don't actually technically need WebPKI. Doesn't mean you can't use WebPKI issued certs. It just says that you don't actually have to use the WebPKI validation. You can still do that. You can still choose to do that. You don't have to. And then there's the question of new RR type or just use an unprefixed TLSA at the name server name. Next slide. And feel free to tell me if I'm going too fast. Anyone, just raise your hand. So the novel thing here, NSV, it's just the NSV is just the mnemonic for a new DNS key algorithm, which is being used to validate NS records. It's used to create a special DS record. It's possible to use a DS record even if the child zone is not signed. If you look at the last line in this slide, it says, unknown DNS key algorithms are treated as insecure rather than bogus. So NSV unaware resolvers don't have problems with this proposed addition. So the idea is, you take the name server name, you put it into a structure, which is technically a DNS key structure. You don't actually publish the DNS key in the child zone. And that avoids making the child zone seem as if it's actually DNSX signed, because it doesn't have to be. You then take the hash of that new record type, and that becomes your DS record. Validating that is using the parent NSR data. So wherever you got an NS record, the target name, which is the right-hand side of the NS record, is the name server name. You follow the same construction method. You take the name server name, you hash it as if it was a DNS key, and compare that against the DS. If it matches, you're good, and you can be reasonably assured that the NS record in the parent for the delegation has not been tampered with. And that's all this is. It's protecting the name server record from an on-path attacker by using DS record and the fact that the DS record is going to be signed in the parent zone. Next slide. DNST for signaling ADOT support. This is just a new record type that would be in the child zone at the name server's name. The record would simply consist of 3 flags that are either set or not set, and indicating support for each of the 3 different transport protocols that I put in the draft. UDP, which is obviously vanilla DNS, and TCP, vanilla DNS, and DOT, which is DNS over TLS to authority. it's using the same owner name. But what I'll point out is that name servers can have more than one name. So if you want to differentiate a name server usage case of having some of the zones that it serves being DOT supported and some other ones not, you give them different names and put in different DNST records, and they all resolve to the same address. And then it's a question of, based on the delegation, what the zone name is, do you try to, or do you want to use DOT or not? Or rather, has that's been explicitly signaled by the name server operator. It's not required to do this. I'm saying it's available as a mechanism. So an authority server operator can do DOT to everybody, DOT to nobody, or potentially do it on a zone by zone basis without actually having anything other than the name server name being a differentiator. And then for DOT to be usable, the client has to validate that the zone is signed, the record is present, and the DOT flag is set. I think that covers that. Oh, and I point out that you can do some odd things that are not really going to be useful outside of the enterprise, but within an enterprise, you could actually set up zones that require DOT and don't support vanilla queries and answers, so that, for instance, the DNS authority server could actually be doing client cert validation to allow it to restrict who's allowed to actually do queries. It's kind of an odd edge case, but it's interesting. Next slide. All of this is about downgrade resistance. That's why the NSV algorithm DS hashes are DS hashes. In the parent zone, they're signed. Restrict the usage of NS to cases where if there's a corresponding DS, that the DS and the NS are in agreement. And the child records in the name server names zone, those are also this DNSX signed zone, so they're signed, and that gives you discovery is downgrade resistant, and certificate validation is protected by DNSSEC. So the worst that an on-path adversary can do is interfere with the connection, but not force a downgrade. Next slide. Yeah, there's some interesting things I was looking at to try and improve the efficiency in terms of the number of round trips. Once a cache is partly warm, not completely hot. For instance, a name server name zone having some of the records have already been resolved, but other ones are not. Is there a way to minimize the number of queries you need to do for a new name server in that zone? And these are just sort of semantic tricks using a couple of different label types and an opt-RR for allowing aggressive NSEC to be used. Probably worth not discussing it in depth here. It's probably worth reading in the draft. Next slide. And this is just explaining why I'm going down the road of it has to be DNSSEC and TLSA. It's so that the clients have the ability to validate using only DNS elements. If you don't require TLSA to be used, then clients can't validate using DANE and they're forced to use WebPKI. So I don't want that to be the case. That's why I'm saying it's got to be TLSA, and that means it has to be DNSSEC signed. That's for minimum operability. The resolvers have the option of not doing DNSSEC validation and of doing WebPKI validation if they wish. This isn't forcing the clients to do anything. It's making sure that if the clients want to do DANE validation, that they can. And the only things that actually have to be signed are the name server zones, the zones that contain the names of the name servers themselves. It's usable for privacy on unsigned zones. I'm not saying don't encourage DNSSEC. I'm saying it's optional. Next slide. Yeah, it's a work in progress. Hasn't had very much review because I didn't aggressively push it out earlier. I'm taking this on as one of many projects, and I'm trying to find good ways that are easy to implement and easy to deploy, the minimum amount of additional work for the specific things like DNST. It's such a small draft. I think it doesn't require much review. It could probably even go straight to working group last call with like only a few reviews and getting an early code point assigned so that implementations can be done. It's trivial. It's 3 flags. The NSV is probably a little bit more controversial. That I think is, if I'm not mistaken, that's sitting in dprive rather than DNSOP. And that's probably where the bulk of the discussion is going to happen, plus ADOT itself. Yeah, that's all I got.
Hi, thank you, Brian. There are 2 people in the queue. 3. It's still on. We do have sufficient time to discuss. Ben, please go ahead.
Hello. So Brian, I think it's fair to say that you and I are thinking along pretty similar lines.
Yes.
For a lot of these topics.
Yes. And I'm happy to have any pieces of these incorporated and merged as people see fit.
So, obviously we've had a lot of debate about exactly how the fine details of all of this should work, but
yes.
But I think it's actually a good thing that we've got lots of interest in trying to find a solution here and similar ideas about what the solution should look like. So, in the details, I have 2 thoughts. So, well, first, I don't think that we are ready to jump in and move forward with any of these proposals. I think there's a bunch of deep questions here that we're not just going to plow ahead.
Oh, the parent proposals you're talking about, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
But for DNST specifically, so my view is, as I'm sure most people here know, but maybe not all, there is an adopted draft called Service Bindings for DNS in the ADD working group that specifies a way to signal the supported set of secure transports for a DNS server. That draft, so that draft is essentially, in my view, very similar to DNST. I would strongly prefer not to have 2 solutions there. The service bindings for DNS draft is not in last call. If you feel that there are changes you'd like to see in it, please take those to ADD and we can discuss whatever changes you want. If you think it should be a different RR type, I think ADD and that draft is the place to have that discussion.
Okay. I haven't been following ADD for a long time, so I wasn't aware of that.
So that's.
But yeah, I actually did originally start with trying to do this using an SBC binding, but I found that I was using literally none of the value proposition of that, other than basically the flag signaling. So I basically did this as a shortcut to avoid having to make my draft long or to reference other things, and I wanted to minimize the amount needed to deploy. If somebody isn't already doing, for instance, HTTPS and hasn't already done any kind of service binding work, the reason I went with this simple flag mechanism is it's so lightweight to actually implement. I agree we shouldn't have 2 things. It's simply a question of which is more expedient. Is there anything in the service binding things that actually add value that can't be done other ways and better ways? I think it's an offline discussion, but yeah, I agree.
Okay. The other thing I'll mention is that the glueless delegations, we're kind of in the wrong working group for this, but the glueless delegations raise a bunch of very tricky privacy questions, because as I understand it, to hit the performance targets that you're talking about, we essentially disable the ADOT mechanisms when we're chasing these glueless delegations. And so it's assumed that the queries involved in the glueless delegation process are no longer sensitive. I think that's only true if the child zone, if the NS in the child zone is not only out of bailiwick, the original NS record is not only out of bailiwick, but also itself non-sensitive. So if I have, company1.com and I have and I put my name servers under company1.net, they're out of bailiwick, but they're still disclosing the same piece of information potentially. So
correct. Yes.
I would like to see a little more discussion of that. I think it makes the system easier to reason about if we don't have to restrict ourselves to particular architectures like that.
Yeah. Now, and again, I would point out that after having thought about it a bit more, the glueless is a recommendation, not a requirement. The only thing I think it actually ends up being a requirement is the bailiwick issue. I think is core to the whole thing.
Okay, thank you. Victor, you're next.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want me to give a quick answer now? Do we have time? The first one. Oh, sorry.
Yes, please. We do have
okay.
About 10,
so on the
10 minutes. Yeah.
On the first question, in my presentation, I think I skipped over this as a detail, but or maybe I removed it. It was in the other presentation. I'm not assuming that that even if you have transport security, that you can rely on that for data integrity. So I know this is probably a little bit controversial because I haven't actually shown my work, but it is possible to poison TLDs, and you could become a man in the middle for a TLD, at which point you can't necessarily become a TLD for the TLS situation, but you can for the non-TLS situation, which means that you can serve up bad data even if you weren't originally on path. You make yourself on path with poisoning a resolver. Anyway, the gist of it is, with NSV, you remove that as being even a remote possibility. Can't remember the other part of the question about NSV. I'll answer the second question, and then if I didn't answer adequately on the first question, we can go back to that. For the motivation for getting rid of the prefixes, it's mostly about the ability to get the signaling and actually, I guess the TLSA part, it's only the DNST that matters for the signaling. The TLSA part could still be underneath the individual. I guess it's just to allow a more scalable population of a zone if you have the ability to do some kind of wildcard. And the only way to discover that you're able to use that wildcard is if the owner name happens to be the same, and you can see that in an NSEC record that shows that there is no TLSA record at that owner name. But that's mostly for optimizing the number of round trips on a warm cache, not hot but warm. Yeah, I think it's probably a thing to discuss on the mailing list more.
Okay.
There. I just had a question for you about the NSV algorithm type for DS. Same question that I actually asked Ben in the deprive meeting, which is, have you attempted to deploy this NSV algorithm to any parent zones that are significant? I mean, obviously you can run your own parent zone. Have you attempted to deploy it to any active ones, and what was the results of that?
I tried a few, but I was limited mostly to whatever the UIs were supporting. The UIs differ, but generally will have drop-downs as opposed to free form for the algorithm values. But I'm going to work with my coworker to try and do a more direct API as opposed to UI. Since we're registrar, we can actually do that and send the results up to different TLDs. So I haven't succeeded, but I haven't done the more in-depth trials on that. My suspicion is that as long as an algorithm has had a code point assigned to it, it's much easier to convince a registrar to update their UI to allow the code point to be used. The main issue, I think, is going to be on the parental side, and whether or not a registry is going to be willing to accept plain text rather than a hashed DS value. By sticking with an existing DS hash, I see very little likelihood of there even being any contentiousness to this. It's still doing comparisons of hashes, and the only purpose of that is to validate existing parental records, i.e. the NS records. So I don't think there's going to be any pushback from registry operators, which is where I think the biggest part of friction is going to be for getting the optimization under the DS glue kind of mechanisms.
So a report back about what you found would be great to the mailing list. Thank you for doing
absolutely, for sure.
Thank you. Victor, please go ahead.
Specifically on the question of registries, if I remember correctly, .de will not accept the NSV DSRR set because at the time at which you upload your DS records, they actually do live queries against the child to make sure it has matching DNS keys at the zone apex during EPP, and they'll reject the update. Yeah. So some registries will change their practice.
Yeah, this would require me going to Peter Koch and twisting his arms substantially, or other people at DE. But modulo then actually saying, yeah, okay, that's going to be a problem for DE. And I think there may also be an issue with CA, Canada. I think they require both of them to be presented. I don't know what they do with the DNS key other than just validating that it matches what ends up in the DS. That may or may not be a problem. It remains to be seen.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, working group. You have enough directions and feedback, Brian, I think.
You know, overall, I think, yeah, I'm happy, happy enough, and look forward to continuing discussions on the list
on the mailing list. Okay, thank you. Then we come to an end of the agenda for today. So tomorrow we have another session of an hour. During this session, there was a continued discussion on the NSEC 3 iteration guidance on Jabber. So we asked Wes whether he was available tomorrow to continue this discussion in the working group. So we will reserve another 10-15 minutes for tomorrow to continue the discussion on NSEC 3 and finally nail some numbers or, well, Suzanne, you want to add something to that?
Sure. Just thanks everybody for your time. We are still, and I think I said this in the chat, we are still working on the ideal way to do agendas for the big IETF meetings and interims and the rate that we accept new work, but people should always feel free to work on things, comment on drafts that are of interest. And in fact, the more work has been done on a draft, by the time it's out, the adoption is requested, the more likely it is to be in some kind of shape to really get into and solve remaining problems and move on. So thanks everybody for your time, and we will see you tomorrow.
Indeed. So
thanks all. Oh, one other thing. There have been a couple of drafts that were discussed today where it sounds like cross-area review would be a really good idea. And it's not completely obvious immediately where to go for that review, but that's something we can work on with Warren and the IASJ. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. See you tomorrow.